It is my pleasure to welcome you to episode 8 of the Stamp Chat series 2023, titled Behind the Scenes of UNEXPO 2023, plus a little extra. And this features not one, but two presenters with lifetimes of philately to share, Greg Galletti and Fran Adams. We'll start with Greg. Greg is currently on the APS Board of Vice Presidents and previously served as the Vice President of the Board of Trustees of the American Philatelic Research Library. He is also a proud founding member of the United Nations Philatelists, Inc., and is currently serving as its president. He has been an avid collector of UN and UN-related material, as well as Swiss League of Nations overprint issues for 50 years. He's an avid exhibitor, having started as a junior exhibitor a mere 46 years ago, and has developed some fascinating exhibits on UN-related subjects and Swiss League of Nations issues, and has earned 3 Reserve Grand Champion Awards at World Series of Philately Exhibitions for his efforts. He's also a proud recipient of the AAPE Diamond, Ruby, and Sapphire Awards for his many award-winning exhibits. Greg is also an avid philatelic writer, having developed dozens of articles on UN-related topics, and is currently working on a book on the League of Nations stamps and postal history. In addition to the APS and the UNPI, Greg is a proud member of many other stamp societies, including the American Topical Association, the American FDC Society, which covers for those of you just joining us as stamp collectors, the American Helvetica Philatelic Society, the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors, and the Royal Philatelic Society of London. Greg has also been recognized for his leadership efforts with several honors, including the UNPI Richard Powers Lifetime Achievement Award, the UNPI President's Award, the American Philatelic Society Nicholas Carter National Volunteer Award, and is a proud member of the APRL Boys from Bruce Fellowship Program. Sorry about that. Okay, Greg, I'm going to let you take it away. I'm going to screen share in a minute. Why don't you introduce yourself and fill in any gaps that I may have left in that presentation?
Oh, you said more than was necessary, but welcome everybody. You probably recognize this beret more than you would recognize me, but typically at the Great American Stamp Show and other stamp exhibitions, I tend to wear this hat because it represents the United Nations and it represents peacekeeping, and it's a good talking piece, if you will, to get people to come over to our club booth and just have discussions about United Nations philately. So that's typically why I wear this at the shows. What I'd like to discuss this evening are two things. One, very briefly, I will give you an introduction to UNEXPO 2023, and then we'll go into an introduction to United Nations Philately in a way that you're probably not very familiar with UN Philately, and that is from the historical philatelic perspective or social philatelic perspective. So let's start with UNEXPO 2023, and what is that? UNEXPO 2023 is a 2-day World Series of Philately exhibition that will focus on United Nations and UN-related topics. The show, which will be October 20 and 21 of this year, just a couple of weeks from now, is going to be held at the APS American Philatelic Center in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. And what would be typical of a show like this, a 2-day show, is we plan to have upwards of 100 frames of UN and UN-related philatelic material in a competitive exhibition. And in addition to that, we'll probably have another 20 to 25 frames of Court of Honor material for specialized UN material. We will also have a series of presentations over the 2 days on a wide range of topics related to UN philately. And finally, if you look at the picture in the lower left-hand corner, you might recognize a couple of those folks. But what's typical of us, the United Nations philatelists, and Scott English likes to call us the bad boys of philately, we actually enjoy getting together both during the shows and certainly in the evenings for some fine food, camaraderie, and just relaxation. So typically at these kinds of shows, after the exhibit closes around 6 p.m., we often get together and go out and have a good time. Okay, next slide, please. So as part of this series, what I should mention is UNEXPO 2023 is actually our third UN stamp exhibition. Originally, we had our first in 2017 in Bellefonte, and then we were planning to have a second expo in 2021, but thanks to COVID, that crushed those plans, and we ended up going to the show up in Boston area at the Boxborough Philatelic Show. And then, of course, as I mentioned, in a couple of weeks, we will be doing UNEXPO 2023. So what you see in front of you are these journals, and those journals are the typical product that the club, the United Nations Philatelists, puts out 6 times a year. And when we are planning to do a UNEXPO, we devote one of those 6 issues to the expo itself. And so it becomes the show program. And what you would typically see in there is the schedule of events, the exhibits, the dealers that are going to be at the show. But in addition to that, we make a very special effort with this particular journal to have very short, concise articles on a wide range of UN philatelic topics. Typically, in each of these journals, the presentations or the stories will be 1 page to perhaps maybe 2 pages on a very specific topic. And what that does is it provides you as a collector that may not be familiar with United Nations philately, a broad range of topics that you will be exposed to that we consider to be part of United Nations philately. So for instance, you see there the French United Nations General Assembly issues, the country of France, to commemorate the General Assemblies in 1948, 1951, issued special stamps for those occasions. And this is a story about the stamps that were issued in 1948. In addition, if you go to the lower left, we have a very nice presentation on something that you're probably familiar with if you're a UN collector, and that's the UN pre-cancel stamp of 1952. And Tony Dewey, who is an expert in that area, provided a story related to that stamp and its use. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I must say the journals, these journals are available. If you come to the show, we will have a supply of those that you may have to get you acclimated to what United Nations philately is. So let's look at what is typically considered United Nations philately. And if you look at these images, they're probably all too familiar. If you ever go surf on places like eBay or Delcamp, you'll often see these sorts of lots of kiloware of United Nations material, whether it be stamps or first aid covers or stationery or souvenir cards or souvenir folders. And most people would consider this to be the realm of United Nations philately. That is what encompasses UN philately. But what I'm here today to show you is that UN philately is far, far more than just the stamps that the United Nations has issued since 1951, or other philatelic items such as stationery, first aid covers, souvenir cards, and presentation folders. So what I'd like to try to provide you is a perspective that UN philately is actually a really wonderful philatelic theme that will take you throughout the world's history, from war to peace, to world health, to education, to peacekeeping, to any number of topics that you can actually find United Nations material and build really valuable collections that are rich in history and would make wonderful exhibits if you were so inclined to start developing exhibits. Okay, next page, please. Okay, so thank you. So let's start with the topic of world peace. Obviously, when you think about the United Nations, you think about peace, and that's one of the main ideals and aims of the organization, is to maintain peace. So if you consider where the notion of peace started, it didn't start with the United Nations. It started centuries before the UN as we know it existed. And there are philatelic artifacts out that are available to collectors that would help you develop a collection associated with world peace. And here's just a smattering of some covers that I put together. And I just want to give you some examples here. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a very small, illustrated cover. And that's from the American Peace Society. You can hardly read it. It's in the lower left-hand corner. That was based in Boston, Massachusetts. And that organization was formed in May of 1828. And it was actually the combination of other peace societies that previously existed in the New England area, namely Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So it's really a lovely small envelope that certainly conveys the notion of world peace and peace on earth and goodwill towards men. Okay, if we transition to the next, not the next slide, just the next, if you can go back, yeah. Okay, so the next two covers we see here are a little bit more official, if you will. And the upper left-hand cover is from the United States Commission to a delegation, a peace conference in the Netherlands that was convened at the request of Tsar Nicholas II. And that cover is a philatelic example from the conference that convened in 1899. Now, the idea was that was the first conference where international states got together, discussed the ideals of peace, and they generated a couple of interesting documents to help guide the peace process moving forward. The idea was to continue with these peace missions and peace conferences over the course of several years. The next one was done in 1907, again in the Netherlands. And you see that second cover shows you the second conference for peace. And that's an official corner card from the conference. And what's different about this cover is, in fact, the Dutch government produced a very special circular date cancel in honor of the conference. So as part of collecting United Nations and UN forerunners, we look for things such as this, where you have covers that have corner cards related to an organization or peace. There are cancellations that express the notion of peace or are specific to conferences related to peace. And then you have official service covers like the one from the US delegation while they were at a particular conference. So these are all the sorts of postal history that one of a United Nations collector might be looking for if you were to try to bring together a collection associated with world peace. Now, the last two covers down at the bottom here are also related to peace. And again, if you look at the very last one, it's a League to Enforce Peace. William Howard Taft, who I think everybody knows, was president of that organization back in the early 1900s. And the corner card will show that that particular organization was located in New York City. There were several others that were located around the United States. And one of their aims, in addition to enforcing peace, was, of course, to get the United States to buy into the League of Nations. Now, that never happened, but of course, these organizations flourished for a time being, and they promoted the League of Nations and its work. The second cover up there is a similar cover from a League of Nations union, and you can see a very nice Cinderella that's tied to the cover. And the League of Nations union was similarly a pro-League organization in Great Britain at the time. So again, as a collector, you might look for corner cards that identify these organizations or Cinderella stamps that may have some tie to the organizations. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start a little bit about the formation of the League of Nations. And again, why the League of Nations? Well, quite frankly, the League of Nations is the forerunner agency or organization that led to the development of the United Nations. If you will, it was the blueprint for the development of the United Nations. And many of the organizations associated with the League ended up becoming specialized agencies of the United Nations later on. So where did the League come from? Well, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, we have a very nice cover from the German peace delegation to Versailles. And you'll notice a origin cachet, a purple rubber stamped cachet for the delegation. There's also a special cancellation that the French PTT put together, honoring the Congress. And it was at this particular Congress where the Treaty of Versailles was signed between Germany and the Allied powers. And part of that treaty described the Covenant of the League of Nations. And it's at that point, around June of 1919, that we consider the starting point for the League of Nations. Now, once that was done, the League had to develop into an actual organization. And the main organization of the League was the League Secretariat. And for a very, very short period of time, probably about 6 or 8 months, that Secretariat started to get developed in London, England. And what we see here are 2 pieces, a nondescript cover, if you will, on the bottom with a wavy line cancellation from London. And then fortunately, the letter that was enclosed in that envelope still exists. And if you look above it, you see there is a small letter on League of Nations stationery that was sent to this gentleman, Emmett Page, in New York. And it was signed by Eric Drummond. And Eric Drummond was the first Secretary General of the League of Nations. So without that, the letter attached to the envelope, we quite frankly may never have understood that this envelope was actually a League of Nations cover, because there's nothing on the exterior of the cover that would even identify itself in any way that it was associated with the League of Nations. And then finally, when the League of Nations transitioned from England to Geneva, Switzerland, which is its permanent location, the Secretariat moved there, and the Swiss government produced some stamps, which were overprinted, Société des Nations, and you'll see a small cover in the lower left, which is a League of Nations envelope, and you'll see the 10 centime William Tell stamp tied to the cover with a special Geneva 1 Société des Nations circular date stamp. So the Swiss, as part of arrangements with the League of Nations, provided overprinted stamps for official use only, and a special cancellation that was used specifically at the League post office. Okay, next slide, please. So let's transition a little bit. We know something about the League of Nations, but what did they really do? I mean, if you think about it, the League of Nations existed between 1919 and 1947, 46, 47 timeframe. And so during that time frame, you had various conflicts around the world, and certainly you had World War II leading up to the demise of the League of Nations. But one of the areas that might be interesting to collectors, especially if you're into military mail or peacekeeping missions, things of that nature, is to look for covers related to the League of Nations activities as it relates to war effort or peacekeeping missions. And so I've got a couple of examples here for you. So after World War I, the League of Nations set up early peacekeeping operations in the Saar region of Germany. Now, after the war, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, that Saar region was taken from Germany, if you will, and the proceeds from the sales, mainly of coal and other items, were then distributed mainly to France, but some of the Allied powers. After 15 years, there was going to be a plebiscite to decide the fate of the Saar region. And at that time, the League of Nations decided that they really needed to get involved and make sure that they had some boots on the ground, if you will, to control this plebiscite and the ensuing voting and things associated with the determination of the final determination of the Saar region. So what we see here are 2 examples from that time frame. The first one in the upper left is a Swedish military letter that was canceled in the Saar. It has a special Swedish battalion date stamp, and that piece of stationery was made specifically for military use. A letter that bears a special date stamp from the Italian commanders in the Saar. Now, during that period of time, several contingents were in the SAR, as we saw the Swedish, the Italian, but also the British, the Dutch, and there are some Belgian forces that were in the region at the time. And each of those organizations did have philatelic materials, either cancellations or stationery, at their disposal for use on our mail going home or going to official purposes. So that's one area that you may want to explore, is looking for the service mail of this very, very early peacekeeping operation. The second cover we have in the lower right is a beautiful air mail cover that was sent from the League of Nations. And if you look closely, you'll see there's a whole host of disarmament stamps. Those are the Swiss disarmament issues of 1932. And each of those is overprinted Société des Nations. As I pointed out, the Swiss PTT provided the League of Nations these overprinted issues to use on official service mail. So if you go and you look at this cover, it's going from the League of Nations to this area in the Amazon jungle called Leticia. And what is Leticia? Leticia was a small peninsula of land between Colombia and Peru. And it was a port of trade, and was used by both countries for that purpose. And back in the early 1930s, a group of militants from Peru came into that region and basically took it over. And they acted as administrators of that region for a period of time until the Colombian government decided they had had enough, and they sent their own troops in, and they had some skirmishes along that region. That issue was brought to the attention of the League of Nations, and the League dispatched a special commission to administer control over the territory for about a year while negotiations were in place to resolve the conflict. So these covers, which are not very plentiful at all, I think there may be something less than 20 of them known throughout the world, are a wonderful example of a very short-lived activity of the League of Nations, again, related to conflict and control. I'll pause there for a second if you go back, because I want to mention that my co-presenter here tonight, Fran Adams, is an expert in this area, and Fran has written a wonderful book on the Leticia incident, which covers all of the known covers, all the known cancellations, and things that are important from a philatelic and historical standpoint. Okay, and the final cover here I wanted to point out is not a League of Nations cover, but it is actually, can we go back? Other way. Yeah, there we go. Okay, it's a United Nations cover, and it's a United Nations military mail cover. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at the corner card, it's from the UNTSO, which is the United Nations Treaty, what is it? Truce Supervision Organization. And they were set up in the Gaza area as part of the control during and after the first Gaza war between 1959 and I believe 1967. So if you look at this cover, it's kind of interesting. It went to Dr. Ralph Bunche, and I think most people will know who Ralph Bunche is. And so again, as part of a collection, it's not only the corner card that's important, but to collectors like us, from a historical perspective, the receiver of the mail, the addressee, and the addressor are usually very important in developing the story on what is important about the cover. Okay, next page, please. Okay, the other topic I want to touch base on is called the issue of refugees. And again, the League of Nations, starting in the early 1920s, recognized after World War I that there was millions of displaced persons around the world that needed to be dealt with. And they created a High Commission for Refugees. And we have, thankfully, philatelic items that identify this organization and the work of the organization. So very quickly, I'll just say in the upper left-hand corner, you have a very nice cover Again, we focus on the corner card, the addressee, and the addressor. And this corner card is from the delegation France that was part of the commission. Now, during the repatriation of refugees, Fridtjof Nansen, who was a delegate to the League of Nations, was elected to be the first High Commissioner for Refugees. And as part of his duties, he developed a program that included what was called Nansen passports. And there's an example, of one of the passports in the center there. And you'll notice there is a very nice stamp, and that stamp is what we consider to be a Nansen passport stamp. It's actually kind of a revenue stamp. And there are a series of those stamps that were issued in the late 19 or mid 1920s through the mid 1930s. They are very collectible, and it would make a wonderful collection and exhibit if somebody were to try to develop the story of the Nansen refugees. Now, the League of Nations, recognizing that the refugee problem was really a problem of work and occupation, transferred the duties of the High Commission from the League itself over to the Bureau of International Travel, the BIT. And here's an example of a cover that was also part of the refugee organization with the BIT corner card. So again, this documents the history of how refugees were dealt with during and after World War I. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the United Nations. How are we doing on time? Okay, let's try to get through quickly then. So in San Francisco, 1945, there's a very special conference called the UN Conference on International Organization. And as part of that conference, it was actually the birth of the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations was developed as a result of that conference. Now, there are many philatelic artifacts that one could collect to represent the conference itself. In the upper left-hand corner, we have an example of an official corner card envelope from the conference. There are many different varieties of these known. Granted, they are relatively scarce. Some of them are unique. Some there's only maybe a handful available, that have been identified. But they are an area of collecting that is very popular amongst UN postal historians. In addition to covers, you might get more involved with ephemeral material, such as the plate block of US 928. It's a nice plate block, but what makes it even more interesting, it's signed by President Harry Truman. And then next to it, we have a piece of stationery that was used as, for a letter from the Secretary of State, time Edward Stenius, and you can see that he was at the time chairman of the U.S. committee. And then finally, down at the bottom, one of my favorite pieces, I think everybody that's a first day cover collector knows about Dorothy Knapp and her outstanding covers that she created. Well, us UN collectors can say Dorothy liked the United Nations as well, because we have a beautiful cover here that she hand painted for the conference. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about transition. I mentioned that the League of Nations ended in around 1946. The UN was born in 1945, so there was a transition period of about a year. And how do we know, or do we have any philatelic evidence of that? Yes, indeed. If you look at the cover on the top of the page, you'll see the corner card is actually a United Nations corner card from its temporary location in Hunter College, New York, but it's addressed to a gentleman that worked at the League of Nations. And at the time, the League of Nations had an office just outside of Princeton University that dealt with economic, financial, and transit issues. So here's a very nice cover that represents that transition. It also bears a very nice meter cancellation with a UN slogan. And Pitney Bowes, back in the early 1940s through 1950, 51, developed a series of UN meter slogans that were given to the United Nations for use on their service mail. And again, there are many of those known, and it makes a wonderful collecting area. Now, in addition to the transition covers, once the United Nations started, we look for service covers of the activities of the organization. One of the things that we'll look for are covers from the General Assembly or other conferences. And the two covers, upper right and lower left, are examples of covers that represent those assembly type activities. And finally, one of the other areas that we look for are the locations of the UN offices throughout New York in the early days prior to the UN headquarters being built. And we focus often on both the cancellations and the corner cards to show us representation of where the UN was at any point in time between 1945 and about 1952. So this final slide, what I want to show here, these are more contemporary items that one might collect as a United Nations collector. Again, if you look at the top cover, it's interesting. It's from the UN delegation, United Kingdom delegation to the UN, when they were actually in the Empire State Building back in the early 1950s. What makes it interesting, it's actually a mourning cover, which is identified through that black thick line around the outside of the cover. The second cover is something people are probably familiar with. It's the UN pre-cancel. There were many different mailings associated that used the UN pre-cancel. This particular one was from, I believe, the first mailing. It's a type B cover. And again, Tony Dewey has a fantastic exhibit on this topic that covers all of the different known mailings and how you would identify those mailings. And finally, we have a cover from the UN Emergency Forces. Again, if you're a military man, this is the type of material you might be looking for. And this one came from the commander of UNEF to Dag Hammarskjöld. Okay, well, I hope you got a good primer on UN from a historical point of view, and I'll turn it over to Fran.
The second speaker tonight is Fran. Fran is a renowned collector and exhibitor with many grand awards to his name, who specializes in thematic exhibiting on topics related to the origins of the United Nations, as well as archaeology and others. He's also an author, a devoted advocate of digital philately. Some examples of his work include a recent article about Annamites in the Mesozoic Times, published about prehistoric life times authors in philately. His AAPE 2021 Renee and the thematic philately class for his exhibit documenting the efforts between 1947 and 1951 of the fledgling United Nations organization to settle the land dispute between Arab and Jewish populations, and his 2020 book titled The Oceanographic Institute and Museum of Monaco, the First 50 Years, 1910 to 1960. And it documents Prince Albert, Monaco's earliest efforts to systemically study the world's countries. It's a lot of range. If you don't know what an Annamite is, I'd suggest you make it one of your questions in the question box, and you will get the questions after a few more minutes.
So before we jump into this, I just wanted to mention that a lot of the items that you saw in Greg's presentation are extremely rare. The 1899 cover, there are 3 known. So it's not like, you know, these things are modern where you print all kinds of thousands of them. They're extremely rare, and they tell a history that otherwise is not presented anywhere in philately. We're going to take a little look at a story about the memorial service for Franklin Roosevelt that happened in the Muir Woods, and that's up near San Francisco. So in 1945, when the conference was going on there, it started in April, and in May is when they had this memorial service. So to take a look through this presentation, we're going to see things that are not necessarily United Nations. However, they do depict the subject well of an event that is not necessarily documented specifically in UN material. This first one is a postcard. So it simply pictures the Muir Woods area where that plaque that you see in the bottom center, okay, is the memorial just for Roosevelt. Muirwood's Inn, yep. Okay, next slide. So Roosevelt, naturally, everybody knows, was one of the big promoters of the United Nations. And between him and Churchill, they actually pushed and got this idea moving along. And Stalin jumped in, he was included. And the main thrust of this was the ideals of the four freedoms. They are freedom from want, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, okay? And essentially, that's what the charter of the UN is based on. So Roosevelt in 45 decided that, yes, we should have this conference, a preparatory conference, and also include Stalin. He wanted to have it somewhere on the west coast of the United States, but Stalin refused to fly anywhere. He wanted it in Russia. And Roosevelt eventually said, okay, we'll have it in Russia, and Yalta in the Crimea was where they agreed to have the conference. Now on the left, you'll see the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, okay, that were at the conference, led the conference. Down below that, you'll see a propaganda forgery that was made by the SS during the war. And they were looking at putting Stalin into the same category as the Jewish people that they were eradicating. On the right, you'll see a private postcard that was also mailed at that time with the flags of the three nations, and it was commemorating this meeting. I cannot read Russian, okay? So all I know is it was sent within Russia. There in Yalta, it was determined that they were going to have the big San Francisco, California conference, the UNCIO, Conference on International Organization, and they agreed to the date of the 25th of April. It took place in the Opera and the Veterans Memorial building that you see on the stamp there. Also at the time, the conservation group Save the Redwoods League was based up in San Francisco, and they thought it would be a great idea if one of the conference sessions was held in the Muir Woods, and named for John Muir. There you see on the cover is an advertising slogan that welcomes the United Nations to San Francisco. We're seeing postcards, we're seeing stamps, we're seeing meters, various different things. And as we put this collection together, we're going to use many different types of elements that go into a thematic exhibit. Thematic is a little bit different than topical. Topical is such that if you collect flowers on stamps, then that's all that's there. Where thematic actually tells a story, which is what is happening here. So the proposal was sent off to Mr. X, who was the Secretary of the Interior. He thought it was a great idea and sent it off to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt thought about it, looked it over, And he said, yes, we're going to do this. And they determined that they were going to have one of the sessions of the meeting out in the forest. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died, and he was not able to attend the conference. It was less than 2 weeks before the start of it, and he passed away from a stroke. Harry Truman then finalized plans for the San Francisco conference. You'll see the Opera House and the Veterans Memorial Building in many stamp issues, but this one now is specifically an issue by the United Nations in the center there. And it shows the War Memorial Building. That's a die proof on a card. Again, a different element. On the right-hand side, Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, where his home was. And those are some photo essays of the stamp issues that were issued in 45, but none of those were accepted. Those are unaccepted designs. One of the representatives, specifically the foreign minister from Brazil, suggested that the session that they were going to have in the Muir Woods should be replaced with a memorial service, specifically for Roosevelt. Roosevelt also had designed the stamp that you see there on the left. The BEP then added the little olive branch down at the bottom there, because that was not part of the original design, but they wanted to honor Roosevelt. The first day cover that you see was signed by Pedro Velas. And again, he was the Brazilian delegation chairman. So here we see a plate proof and a first day cover. Other elements again. Secretary of State Edward Stenius, he approved the suggestion personally, and he planned the memorial service. Here's a cover from the Secretary of State, which was Edward Stenius, and it was mailed from Detroit, or to Detroit, several days before the ceremony was taking place. Postal History, and now we're at the bus. Okay, this is a postcard depicting a gray line chartered bus. Those actually were the ones that went through the Muir Woods with tourists. So 500 conference delegates and their wives were loaded onto buses and taken out to the Muir Woods National Monument for the memorial service. They also were able to tour around with guides. They visited prepared displays, and they were able to walk in small groups, just as tourists. And at the appointed time, they made their way over to the Cathedral Grove. Groves are a series of trees that are close together, and they're given various names. This one was a cathedral because it appeared such that when you went to one side of the grove, you could look in and it looked kind of like a church inside. So it was very, very quiet in this area, and it was designated as the first quiet zone in a national park. On the left, we see the Redwood Forest Path, and this stamp was issued for priority mail. Field Marshal Jan Smuts, he was a South African delegation leader. And he was one of the people who knew Roosevelt, and he was featured as a speaker praising Roosevelt. This cover is a service cover from the South African delegation that was attending the UN conference at the time. Stenius, he was the last speaker, naturally, and he praised Roosevelt. And they also put up a permanent bronze memorial plaque. And that was what we saw in that very first slide. So down below, we have one of his calling cards and an item that has the 5-cent Towards the United Nations stamp on it, and it's signed by Edward Stenius. These extra things are just kind of raisins that are in the collection, okay? Things that make it a little bit nicer as a thematic. Go ahead, next one. And then the United Nations Charter was signed by all of the nations that were in attendance. It went out, it was ratified by their Congresses on 24 October 1945. So there were several months between the time it was signed and the time that the last nation certified that they accepted the charter. So 24 October, you may know, is United Nations Day. And that's the reason why United Nations Day is on 24 October. This cover I kind of like. It's a service cover. And it went to Australia. It's using the first souvenir sheet as postage on the anniversary first day of issue. Now, when it got down to Australia, they couldn't find the person. So it was stamped unclaimed and retour, which is return to sender. These auxiliary hand stamps are interesting in themselves, but they add, again, another side to the mail that was sent. Next one. Edward Stenius was appointed as the first United States representative to the UN. He was there from January 46 until June. And the corner card, again, like Greg said, is what we're looking for here. He was the United States representative to the United Nations. And at that time, it was sent to the Association for United Nations, which supported the idea of the United Nations. That's it.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you very much, Greg. You guys are really right on time. We've got about 5 minutes left. We do have a couple questions. I'll leave mine for last. I'm curious, one of the first things, one of the first questions comes from Gerald Davis. He asks, a while back, the New York UNPA issued stamps and lithographs, for the WFUNA. Are they in Scott's UN catalog or anywhere else? I assume that was for Greg.
I do know the Gaines United Nations Philately catalog, which we considered the Bible of UN collecting. Unfortunately, that went out of production and print 25 years ago. But, you know, you can still find those in eBay and other places. And that had a full listing of the Wafuna lithographs and first day covers.
Yeah, I just saw one of the Gaines catalogs.
We have a question from Dr. Frederick Lawrence, who gave us last week's stamp chat. He was, when we were going through your deck of slides, and there was a cancel. I think you had asked for Russian readers. It was early in your slide deck. And go back to, if you can find it. He was I posed to see if anyone could read the Russian, and you could not. And he said that area is from
That
Kazakhstan
would
today.
be very helpful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
let me try to get back there in 1 second. So he mentioned that this is from the area of Kazakhstan now. Did any Russian readers come up from this? Is there anything else to comment about this?
Okay, I took a note.
Yeah, you know, as this brings up a question I was thinking about as I saw this slide as well, which was you were mentioning the propaganda of the Stalin stamp there.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how quickly during wartime can that kind of propaganda, I assume that can be used very effectively and also is very streamlined, is done very quickly inside the process to bring up, to try to embed propaganda into the system. Is that any commentary about how that process gets engaged? I imagine that people who study just that propaganda in the wartime.
Yeah, it was actually printed, okay, at one of the camps. And I think if you look down there, it's Orangenburg was where it was printed. And a lot of those things, to my knowledge at least, okay, were sent off to England and provided to some of the German agents there who distributed them around to various businesses and that sort of thing. So I don't think they were dropped from airplanes, for instance. It was kind of a limited number of those that were printed and distributed. So to my knowledge, there weren't very many.
Next week, hopefully, where we have our own Ken Martin doing a session, stamp chat, again Tuesday night at 7 p.m. for beginning philatelists, for folks who are just coming online to the hobby. Over and out. Good night.